Next, inshallah, we're going to speak about zoology with brother Tanvir Khan. He's going to speak about different animals.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So first we'll talk about a verse from the Quran, Surah number 6, verse 38. And this is about animals and birds living in communities.
Okay. Good. وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم.
So the English translation of this is there is not an animal that lives on the earth nor being that flies on its wings but forms part of communities like you. Research has shown that animals and birds live in communities. In other words, they organize and live and work together. So from evolutionary science, we know that forming groups in the animal kingdom is very beneficial for many reasons, such as for safety from predators, for claiming territory, for sharing food, dividing labor, and especially reproducing, or for the simple family that a lot of animals want to stay near their family members. And some animals with some of the strongest family bonds are elephants, wolves, killer whales, dolphins, lions, chimpanzees, and birds, which migrate together, which I'll be talking about soon. And we'll also talk about how bees and ants have very complex social structures comparable to us humans. And many of these animals mentioned have very human qualities like social hierarchies, and some even mourn for their dead and bury them in the ground. And so first we'll talk about the flight of birds. If you could read the ayah.
ألم يروا إلى الطير مسخرات في جو السماء ما يمسكهن إلا الله إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يؤمنون.
So the translation of this ayah is, do they not look at the birds, held poised in the midst of the air and the sky? Nothing holds them up but the power of Allah. Verily in this are signs for those who believe. This is from the Quran, chapter 16, verse 79. And we have another similar verse, if you could read.
أولم يروا إلى الطير فوقهم صافات ويقبض ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير.
And the translation of this verse is, do they not observe the birds above them, spreading their wings and folding them in? None can uphold them except Allah, most gracious. Truly it is He that watches over all things. And this is from the Quran, chapter 67, verse 19. And in terms of these verses, I would like to mention this very specific species of birds that holds the record for the most time in flight without coming down from the sky. And this species is called swift bird. And every July of every year, it sets out on a migration from Europe to Africa. And it only comes back to Europe in June. And people suspected that this bird flies for a really long time, but no one could prove it until a study in 2013 by Suzanne Eckesen and Anders Hedenstron of Lund University, I believe is in Switzerland or Germany. But basically they caught some swift birds and they put trackers on them, and they found that between the 10 months between July and June, the swifts were almost completely always in the air, and they would maybe come down once or twice. And even though they migrated to Africa, they never actually landed in Africa. They would just fly above Africa. And for example, data from one bird showed that between September 2013 and April 2014, it rested for just 4 nights in February. And then in the following year, it only rested for 1 night. And then the next year, it only stopped for 2 hours. So basically, it was just flying for the entire time between September and April, except for just 2 hours. And according to researchers, they feed, mate, and nest in the air. So you might wonder, when do they sleep? And another study was done on a different bird who also flies for a really long time, because the swift has a really small brain, so they couldn't put sensors on the swift. But they studied another bird called the frigate birds. And these birds can fly up to 2 months at a time. So, and they're a little bit bigger, so they put sensors on them, and they suspected that they might be sleeping while they fly, and they were able to confirm this in August 2016. Niels Rattenborg of Max Planck Institute for Ornithology in Germany, he found that these birds can sleep for a few minutes at a time while they're flying, and for a total of around 45 minutes a day. And they even go into REM sleep, which is a deep sleep where you lose all your muscle control. But these birds keep flying, and they'll even their head will even bob because they go so deep into sleep. But they're still flying, they're okay. And in comparison, if these frigate birds choose to sleep on the ground, they usually sleep for 12 hours in REM sleep. But if they're flying all day, they'll only sleep for 45 minutes that day. And so basically this study proved that they sleep while they're flying, and often they'll sleep with half their brain on, with one eye open, literally, so they don't crash into other birds and they know where they're going. But sometimes they'll even sleep with their entire brains off. And so basically these two examples confirm the miracle of Allah when He says, nothing holds them up but Allah. Verily in this are signs for those who believe. We see that birds can not only fly for 10 months at a time without landing, maybe just for 2 hours, and they can also fly while sleeping. And next we'll talk about the bee. If you could read the ayah.
وأوحى ربك إلى النحل أن اتخذي من الجبال بيوتا ومن الشجر ومما يعرشون ثم كلي من كل الثمرات فاسلكي سبل ربك ذللا يخرج من بطونها شراب مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس إن في ذلك لآية لقوم يتفكرون.
Thank you, Brother Hassan. So he has read the verse on the bee, and also the rest of verse 69 not shown on the screen. But the translation of these verses is, "And thy Lord taught the bee to build its cells in the hills, on trees, and in men's habitations, then to eat of all the produce of the earth, and find with skill the spacious paths of its Lord. There emerges from their bellies a drink, varying in colors, in which there is a healing for people. Indeed, in that is a sign for people who give thought." So the obvious scientific fact from these ayahs is that we all know honey is very good for you, but we'll go into that a little bit later. But from the beginning of the ayah, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, "And thy Lord taught the bee to build its cells in the hills, on the trees, and in men's habitations." And this might sound like Allah taught the bees to take beehives in the mountains, in the trees, and men's habitations, like on people's houses. But we can actually take this much more literally. For example, we know that 70% of all species of bees live in holes instead of in beehives. And we also know there in 1980 there was a discovery by Frank Parker, the former head of the U.S. Department of Agriculture Bee Lab in Utah, where he found a species of bee that can actually build holes in the rocks of mountains. And we know that the word for hills, al-jibali, can also translate to the mountains. So literally these bees, they don't take beehives in the mountains, they make holes in the mountains and they live in the mountains. And there's another species called the carpenter bee, and it gets its name from the fact that it drills holes inside trees to live inside trees instead of taking beehives on trees. And so we see that literally these bees live in the mountains, in the trees. And as for living in people's houses, there's one example in 2007, a woman in Georgia found 120,000 bees with around 100 pounds of honey in the ceiling of her small condo. And it's actually a very common problem for bees to get into people's ceilings and walls. And from all these examples, we can see that the Quran mentions a scientific fact when it says, "And thy Lord taught the bee to build its cells in the hills, on the trees, and in men's habitations. And if we look a little bit deeper into the grammar of these two ayahs, we see that we find a couple more scientific facts. The words used for to build, ittakhizi, the word used for eat, kuli, and the word for find, usluki, are all female forms of the word. Along with this, the word used for bellies, butuniha, grammatically means multiple bellies of a single female. We now know that bees have multiple stomachs, one specifically for honey. So why are all these words female? Because today we know that male bees, called drones, don't gather pollen. They actually don't do anything. They don't build a hive or anything. They just mate with the queen bee. And usually because of the mating process, they die right after doing that. And the all-female bees, other than the queen bee, are called worker bees. And these are the ones that are responsible for everything. They make the hive, they find the food, they produce the honey. And so to summarize, the verse mentioned specifically uses the female conjugation of the verbs to build, eat, and find, and also the female form of the word bellies when mentioning honey. Today we know that the female bee is responsible for all these jobs, while the male is only there for reproduction. And lastly, we'll talk about the lifestyle and communication of ants. If you could read the verse.
وحشر لسليمان جنوده من الجن والإنس والطير فهم يوزعون حتى إذا أتوا على واد النمل قالت نملة يا أيها النمل ادخلوا مساكنكم لا يحطمنكم سليمان وجنوده وهم لا يشعرون.
So the translation of this is, and before Solomon were marshaled his hosts of jinns and men and birds, and they were all kept in order and ranks. At length, when they came to a lowly valley of ants, one of the ants said, O ye ants, get in your habitations, lest Solomon and his hosts crush you under his foot, without knowing it. In recent times, research has shown us several facts about the lifestyle of ants, which were not known earlier to humankind. Research has shown that the animals or insects most closely related to the lifestyle of human beings are the ants. This can be seen from the following findings regarding ants. The ants bury their dead in a manner similar to the humans. They have a sophisticated system of division of labor whereby they have managers, supervisors, foremen, workers. Once in a while, they meet along themselves to have a chat. They have an advanced method of communication among themselves. They hold regular markets wherein they exchange goods. They store grains for long periods in the winter, and if the grain begins to bud, they cut the roots as if they understand that if they leave it to grow, it'll rot. And if the grains stored get wet due to rain, they take out the grains in the sun to dry, and as if they know that the humidity will cause the grain to rot. And I'll go a little bit more detail into their communication. Professor Jeremy Thomas of Oxford University was actually able to record the sounds that ants make when they communicate. Most people think that ants only communicate through chemicals, which is true, but not only chemicals. It was he that was able to prove that they also use varying sounds. And it was also he also studied a certain species of caterpillar that often joins an ant colony, and they sort of adopt this caterpillar and they feed it, and they didn't know why these ants were doing that. I mean, they ate some mucus from the caterpillar, but they didn't understand how the caterpillar was able to just join the ant colony, and they were able to find that the caterpillar actually mimics the sound of the queen ant. And they recorded this sound, and if they played it from a speaker, then the ants would stand to attention for the queen, and they would even try to touch the speaker as they greet their queen ant. And so from this we know that they communicate using sound, they respond to sound, and so from the verse it could be taken very literally that he heard the ant warning the other ants. And similar to the case with the bees, we see that the female verb is used قالت when mentioning that the ant spoke. We now know today, like bees, most of the work is done by female ants. All the male ants are drones, and they all fly. Every single male ant has wings, and so since the ant that Solomon came across was on the ground, and we can assume it was working because he was warning the other ants, it was most likely female. So every single ant you see on the ground outside without wings is a female. And so we can confirm that the Quran was correct in using the female verb to describe that the ant spoke. And that's all I'll speak about today.
MashaAllah. Thank you, Brother Tanvir Khan. He gave very interesting, he spoke about very interesting aspects of the life of birds and animals and how they have communities, how the flight of birds he spoke about. Very interesting. He gave very interesting examples of their flight and how it's so strange that they could fly the whole day, nothing really keeping them up. They sleep such a short amount of time. And then he spoke about the bees, and he also mentioned that we're going to speak about how from the bellies of the bees there comes drink with varying colors.